Well, so really just like to say a big thank you to all of you who are joining, and welcome to our Deep Transformation live conversation today with David Sloan Wilson, where we'll be discussing the core design principles for successful cooperation, among other themes, of course, that relate to that. And of course, as we're here today, the US has just gone through one of the most partisan elections in history. And over in Egypt, COP27 is underway, which seems like this kind of glaring failure of the ability of nations of this world to come together to actually cooperate properly in the face of an existential crisis we're all facing. So it's never seemed really more critical to try to understand how we actually can cooperate among opposing groups, which is why I'm just so thrilled to be in conversation today with a world-renowned evolutionary biologist, David Sloan Wilson, who's really changed the direction of evolutionary theory in the past few decades through his pioneering work, and in the central role, above all, that cooperation has played in the major evolutionary transitions on Earth. And what's most exciting to me is that David has taken these insights from evolution and applied them to our current world. And he's been developing what maybe turn out to be one of the most important frameworks available to us to help us through this century of crisis, these core design principles for successful cooperation. And David has also been walking his talk through his nonprofit organization, Pro-Social World, which I hope we'll get to discuss a little bit more in our conversation today. So the event today, just a little bit of housekeeping, it lasts 75 minutes. The first half hour or so, David and I will be in direct conversation. Then we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you. So when the time comes, be ready to put up your Zoom hand and ask your question directly. But if you'd rather just put the question in the chat, then that's fine, and we'll try to catch those, and I'll try to incorporate them in the second half otherwise. And also welcome, David. So great to see you again. Seems like we've gotten to see each other a fair amount recently, which I am extremely grateful for. And it's so great to have you here joining the Deep Transformation Network community today. So David, I wanted to say, I first came across your work, actually. I was thinking about that just the other day. I realized it was right as I was beginning my research for my earlier book I wrote, The Patterning Instinct, which I wrote some years back, but it took like 10 years or more of research. It was about 15 years ago, I realized that I was just starting it out, and I was finding out to my relief that the sort of Richard Dawkins selfish gene view of evolution wasn't necessarily the only one that was out there, which I was kind of relieved to see, and was being superseded by approaches like your own. And I actually remember a sense of excitement I got when your famous paper came out with E.O. Wilson, Rethinking the Theoretical Foundations of Sociobiology. And everything was kind of really new to me as I was exploring that. And I remember that famous phrase that you kind of, I think you finished the paper with: selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary, which I loved. I thought it was
shamelessly stealing from Rabbi Hillel.
Right, exactly. So I wonder if perhaps you could start out with just some of what that took and what that felt like to you, because it seems like you and E.O. Wilson and others have been right there in the forefront of shifting this kind of mainstream view of evolution. And yeah, perhaps you could just introduce that for us a little bit more.
Oh, well, thank you, Jeremy. And I especially like that I don't need to give a prepared talk here. It can just be pure conversation, which is really a good way to do things. And I spend a lot of time thinking on the last 50 years as quite transformative. In some sense, it's 10% of the history of the scientific revolution, but in other respects, it's very important and transformational in two senses. One is it's the advent of complex system science, which really could not exist before widespread computing capabilities. So, I always like to say the Santa Fe Institute, the famous Santa Fe Institute, was founded in 1984. So that's how new complex systems thinking is. And the other is the expansion of evolutionary science beyond genetic evolution, because for most of the 20th century, Darwin, of course, knew nothing about genes, but for most of the 20th century, the study of evolution has been almost entirely about genetic evolution, ceding the study of cultural evolution to other disciplines. And only during the last 50 years, more or less my career as a scientist, have we achieved a kind of what we can call generalized Darwinism. Generalized Darwinism is any process that combines the ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. And that includes most of the fast-paced changes taking place around us. And another sea change, which is connected to those, is beyond individualism. We can look at the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, as an age of reductionism and individualism. And it's against that background that the kind of selfish gene thinking that you commented upon, and which was dominant when I entered the field, coincided with Homo economicus in economics, the rational actor model, with the concept of methodological individualism in the social sciences, as if everything had to be reduced to individual thought and actions, and society was reduced to just what individuals do to each other in the process of maximizing their self-interest. And so my work, I think, represents, I like to see it in the context of something much broader. And so multi-level selection, the idea that selection can take place at multiple levels, that means that adaptations can either evolve or fail to evolve. We'll get to that. At any level of a multi-tier hierarchy. So that's a kind of I'm painting a broad picture, a broad intellectual picture within which we can take little deep dives in different directions.
Right. Yeah, thanks. And I think you've kind of set some of the framework for what we should be talking about. But one thing I want to do, even before we sort of go into that framework, I want to ask you just a little bit about your own personal trajectory, because obviously you were, a leading thinker in like a theoretical field, evolutionary biology. And I've seen, it was interesting for me because I sort of came across you as an evolutionary biologist, but then I saw your own sort of shift towards getting more engaged in actually changing culture and changing society, and really, it seems like reorienting your life around that. So I'm just curious how that came to you. Was there a sudden shift where you had a realization, oh, I need to refocus, or did it just happen in a very more sort of gradual way? And what was the underlying driver of that directional shift?
Well, to make it quick, let's to begin. My dad was a novelist, a famous one. Sloan Wilson, he helped define the 1950s with his books, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and A Summer Place. And I often say I became a scientist to escape his shadow, but I retained that sort of novelistic urge to understand the human condition. So in some ways, I'm a novelist trapped inside the body of a scientist. I love nature, and I had abundance of nature when I grew up. And so I became an ecologist. But this is at a time I've kind of, in a way, denigrated evolution for being gene-centric. But within those boundaries, the explanatory scope of evolution is amazing. And that's why Darwin said there's grandeur in this view of life. Everywhere he looked, he could explain things on the basis of these simple principles. And that's why Theodosius Dobzhansky, the geneticist, said in the 1970s, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But I lived the dream in a sense, that when I was a grad student, I started out studying zooplankton, little tiny crustaceans that live in the water. But thanks to evolutionary theory, I quickly realized, along with my whole cohort back then, is that I could study any organism, any question, and do so with a simple conceptual toolkit. Any organism, any question, based on this simple set of tools. How amazing is that? And so and part of that expansion of beyond genetic evolution to include all things human meant that I could actually go from studying birds, beetles, microbes, zooplankton, to studying religion, philosophy, psychology, economics. It's part of the nothing about X makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Right.
Now X has expanded to be everything associated with humans, culture, and policy. So that kind of segues to please let's not stay in the ivory tower for this. I mean, if I have insights on how altruism evolves, and if that can be how altruism evolves by cultural evolution, in addition to genetic evolution, that is so useful that you'd be crazy not to leave the ivory tower in order to use some of these powerful ideas.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I get you. That makes so much sense. And it seems like that's one of the crucial shifts, right? Is looking at evolution from being biological to being cultural when we look at more recent history or whatever. And it seems that as humans, there seems to be two layers going on. One is what became really clear to me as I understood your work and others, is that what differentiates humans from other primates, for example, is our ability to cooperate so well, even with those who are not kin. And that seems like it's deeply involved in us through our evolved social emotions. And then there is this cultural evolution, but then cultural evolution, it seems, has kind of not necessarily shifted in gone in more positive, like this unremitting positive direction, right? Because we went from the sort of nomadic hunter-gatherer, band-oriented, where we developed these principles of cooperation, to then these kind of agrarian-style civilizations with hierarchical organization, where it seems like organization worked better in some ways, but not necessarily for the benefit of the people who lived within the actual organization structure itself, right?
Yeah, and so I think we want to introduce the major concept here of multi-level selection early on.
Right.
And I have a lot of practice at this. I have a couple of metaphors that work well.
Yeah.
This is not the first time, but one is the monopoly. Everyone knows about monopoly.
Right.
And so the single game of monopoly is a process of competition among the players of the game. It's a within group competition among members of the group. And there's almost no context for cooperation in a monopoly game. It's all about competition. It's all about capturing all the real estate, driving everyone else extinct. Only context for cooperation is when the current losers cooperate to gang up on the current winner so that they can compete with each other. And so now, if we imagine now playing a monopoly tournament where there's many games in play and the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops their property the fastest. Now what we've done is we've implemented a process of competition among groups, and now everything is about teamwork. And there's no context for competition within you. There's no point in competing with your player at this point. And yet there's no context for cooperation among the teams. And so what we're seeing is a very subtle interplay between cooperation and competition. Competition is always taking place because change does not occur without some things replacing other things. And so evolution, in that sense, is always about competition. But the level at which competition is applied, is it within groups? Is it between groups? Is it between groups of groups? That makes all the difference as to where cooperation surfaces in the population. So it's against that background that we can look at animal societies and we can show that a lot of them are like the single game of Monopoly. And this is something that's very important to communicate, because so often we construct narratives of balance of nature narratives, basically. When we look to nature for inspiration and insight, we mistakenly think that nature writ large, like, all ecosystems, are somehow harmonious, that they strike some kind of balance when left to themselves. But I'm sorry to say that's not true. And if you look at either multi-species ecosystems or single species societies, let's pick the latter, you find they're horribly despotic in human terms. Everything we bemoan about unequal human society exists in a chimpanzee society,
Mhm.
and naked
works.
aggression taking place all the time.
Mhm.
And it's against that background that our species is, as you said, evolved to be highly cooperative at the scale of small groups, a little bit like the Monopoly tournament, And so the good news is this quite amazing cooperation within small groups. And the bad news is, of course, those small groups would compete with other groups. And so you haven't eliminated harm. You haven't eliminated conflict. You've just elevated it to a higher scale. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard has written a book titled The Goodness Paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And the goodness paradox is this paradox that cooperation and competition are joined at the hip, We're really good at cooperation, and we're really good at causing harm.
Right.
Especially to members of other groups. We're brilliant at it. And so
yeah, no, I hear you. And isn't this where this sort of notion of the theory of the commons gets to be so important? Because at least the way that I understand it, if we go back all the way to when we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, we kind of developed sophisticated rules. Like I love the work of Christopher Bohm, the ethologist and biologist and anthropologist, who describes how different groups would work together to stop some big assholes basically taking over. And there's like these sophisticated social technologies. And it seems to me those were the precursors of what developed as sort of commons-oriented ways of managing society, to take in the recognition of the competition, but to find ways to cooperate successfully, and how that can be done at like polycentric levels, of course, not just one level always working against the others. And of course, I'm sure many people here today know the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for developing these understanding of these sort of design principles for the commons. And I understand that you actually worked at some period, you actually worked directly with Elinor Ostrom, if I'm not mistaken, but you've then taken those principles and tried to apply them to more general terms for principles for successful cooperation. So that's something I'd love to really go into right now, because that's is so fundamental, it seems like. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about your interaction with Elinor Ostrom first, and how you sort of went from that and then started to develop these generalized.
Sure. One point I want to make, I call this the archipelago problem, which is that somebody might be a rock star in one discipline or walk of life, and be totally unknown beyond their borders. So when you ask the question, who else heard of Elinor Ostrom? When I ask that question all the time, unless you're a political scientist, then I get only a smattering of hands, 10%, 15%. And that's all the time. This is so important. We find that cultures have evolved to work very well. Thank you very much. Very well. Best practices evolve all the time. But always on one island or another, beyond which they're unknown beyond their borders. And so in business, there's many successful change methods. In education, in neighborhoods, and so one problem we need to solve is the archipelago problem. We need to create a general language. We need to understand these in general terms so that they can be applied at all scales and all context. And it's against that background that what Elinor Ostrom did, she was a political scientist, and she studied the tragedy of the commons. The commons, the common pool of resources. The tragedy is when some people take more than their share. That's what cheating is in the context of a common pool of resource group. Conventional wisdom held that that tragedy would always occur unless you privatize. So this is like a big justification for privatization, or by top-down regulation. And what Ostrom showed by studying common pool resource groups, many of them from indigenous societies was, now this is very important, what I'm about to say next.
Mhm.
They varied in how well they avoided the tragedy of the commons. There was a bell-shaped curve, and some of them at the top of the curve were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons. They were doing things a certain way that enabled them to self-manage their resources. And so Eleanor derived 8 core design principles, which we'll soon list, that were the blueprint basically for self-management. And what I did with her, I met her just before, now she ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 2009, but she was a complete outlier. She was unknown to most economists, back to the archipelago, at the time she won their coveted prize.
Yes.
And there's a very amusing story. Steve Lovett, who wrote Freakonomics, on the day after she won the Nobel Prize, he, on his New York Times blog, he said, well, if you'd asked economists yesterday who else heard of Eleanor Ostrom, 4 out of 5 would have not heard of her. And I'm embarrassed to say I have to count myself among them. And so he had to look her up on Wikipedia to discover who she was. And then he said, economists are going to hate this choice. They're just going to hate this choice. What it means is that the Nobel Prize in economics is becoming a Nobel Prize in social science. And oh, isn't that a terrible thing? And so that's the archipelago problem for you. And so
we can add that it was the first time as ever given to a woman too, which probably didn't go down so well with some.
No. In my book, The Neighborhood Project, I recount this. And also on the online website, evonomics.com, I have a biography of a mini biography of Lynn, which goes through this. So we can provide the link in the liner notes for
thank you.
For this. So she was pretty well known actually in my circle. But meeting her as I did at a workshop, that workshop was titled, Do Institutions Evolve? And this was 2009, was the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of origin of species. So Darwin events were taking place all over the world. And this one was titled, Do Institutions Evolve? So that's where I met her. And I immediately saw how her core design principles could map on to multi-level selection theory. And so on the spot, I said, Eleanor, I want to work with you. And she was sweet enough to say yes. So we worked for 3 years with her associate, Michael Cox, who I still work with until her death in 2012. And she was beloved by everyone who knew her. She was the most nurturing, cheerful person. So everyone should get to know Eleanor Ostrom, and I'm very happy to be a conduit for that.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, that's just so great. And then I think this way in which you took her principles and then sort of generalized them more is what I get so excited about, because I mean, it's clear, like her principles, just to give a sense for people who aren't so familiar with them, just they're things like, and these are her principles for the commons, things like you need clearly defined boundaries. You need this kind of equivalence and proportionality between the benefits and costs of what you're doing. And it's so important that you have you make decisions collectively and monitor it closely within your group, not from outside. And that you have this notion of graduated sanctions. So if somebody breaks some of the rules, you don't instantly like go to execution sort of thing, but you have the sanctions like build up based on the levels. So things like that, those are kind of just to give a sense of some of those principles. But then what you did, David, was you didn't sort of much change the principles, but you looked at ways to make them more universal so they could be applied right and beyond just a commons orientation, but to any groups that are working to cooperate better together. Is that, would you say that's that shift?
Yeah, exactly. And so we can understand them in terms of this eternal contest between altruism or pro-social. First, some key words. Altruism is not a great word because it's two-dimensional. For many people, altruism, there's an other-oriented dimension, but there's also a self-sacrificial dimension, as if the only way to help others is by sacrificing something for yourself. Pro-social is more of a one-dimensional word, where it's basically anything, behavior, attitude, institution oriented towards the welfare of others or society as a whole qualifies as pro-social, even when you benefit along with everyone else. So it includes win-win situations in addition to sacrificial situations. And so pro-social behaviors, extending yourself towards others or one's group as a whole, is inherently vulnerable to more self-serving behaviors. It's just intrinsically the case. I can't help you. I mean, especially from an evolutionary perspective, which is based on relative fitness. It doesn't matter how well you survive in absolute terms, only compared to those in your vicinity. And so extending yourself to others almost inherently places you at a relative fitness disadvantage compared to somebody who doesn't. So the only way that pro-social behaviors can evolve is with a degree of social control. So social control, basically ways to stop self-serving behavior is necessary. Otherwise selfishness beats altruism within groups. And indigenous societies have a genius for social control. That's what Christopher Bohm and Richard Wrangham show so beautifully for hunter-gatherer societies. And so this is something, now we've achieved a level of generality, no matter what kind of group it is. And I invite everyone listening on this call to just think of the groups in your life. Every human being participates in multiple grouping, starting with your partner, if you have one. That's a group of size 2. Or your family, or your business, or your neighborhood, or your school, or your church, or your nonprofit, or your whatever. All of these are groups of people that are attempting to do something together that requires coordinated action and so on. And all of them are vulnerable to various forms of disruption, either passive or active. So free-riding, in other words, doing nothing, is a disruption. In a group where we're all supposed to be doing something, doing nothing is a form of cheating, not to speak of active exploitation. Absolutely. And by the way, intentions might have nothing to do with it. I know that what I'm about to say is part of everyone's experience.
Right.
There can be a group in which everyone is well-meaning, and can I swear, they still fuck up. Right. And so do I get some thumbs up here for that being
exactly. No, I hear you. But so here's where my thinking is going right now. Suppose, because I really appreciate how you're developing these principles for cooperation. You can put them out there in the world and help groups to learn to cooperate each other. But so now here's it's a question that David Kortzen has raised with us both in the last week. So say you get a group coming to you and say, hey, we're this corporation, and we want to learn from you how we can cooperate more successfully within our area, so we can basically, exploit other people more and, extract more. And I'm curious about two things. One is just from a theoretical point of view, just for you to explore a little bit with us how, obviously, if cooperation is adaptive at one level, it can be maladaptive at another level. And if we're thinking about all of humanity or all of life on Earth, then how do we deal with that issue? And then I'm also curious how you, from a practical point of view, deal with that issue. If you have some organization come to you to be a consultant to help them, it's a little bit like you have this issue in mindfulness too. And people can say mindfulness is a beautiful way for people to learn to be more effective. And then the army comes along and says, yeah, we want to have you teach mindfulness to our sharpshooters so they can be better focused at killing people. How do you work through those moral levels, and how to deal with a theoretical level?
Well, first, if you really understand multi-level selection theory,
Right.
and you extend it to multiple levels, then you deeply appreciate, as I've taken recently to say, that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. And so individual self-preservation is a good thing until it leads to self-dealing. Helping kith and kin, a good thing until it leads to cronyism and nepotism. My corporation, a good thing until it leads to all sorts of inequality. Strong economy, a good thing until it leads to overheating the earth. My nation first, a good thing until it leads to international conflict. And so almost everything that we recognize as a pathology, including those listed by David Korten, in which corporations basically cooperate in order to exploit. And so much now is based on monopolies and duopolies and oligopolies that are basically colluding, cooperating with each other in order to exploit their customer base. That's exactly what you would expect. That's what we see, and that's what you expect. And so the question is, what's the solution? Of course, and the solution, which is forced upon you. So this is very, very deep and fundamental theoretically. There's no way around it, really. We have to have the whole planetary system in mind. Now, everyone on this call already has this ethic, so that can't be new, at least to the people in this group. But there is a new and powerful argument for making that case, that unless we plan our actions with the welfare of the whole earth in mind, forget about it. We're going to get the perverse alchemist is going to be permuting gold into lead. That's what we see all around us. But a global ethic by itself is not enough. And it's just, we're not equipped just to, all the time plan our actions with and so this is where multi-level and multi-context comes in. We could go to the opposite extreme, and we can talk about the importance of small groups. The small group, appropriately structured, they got to have the core design principles, which we haven't listed yet, by the way. Small groups, purposeful groups, groups that exist for something that's important for their members, and groups that are appropriately structured. That is the fundamental unit of human society. Individuals never lived alone in our evolutionary history. They always lived in the context of small and, for the most part, cooperative groups, even when those groups were warring with other groups. And so to rebuild the cellular fabric of society is something that we could all take part in doing, and we don't have to ask anyone's permission. All we need to do is to make an effort to function in the context of small and appropriately structured groups, and that's pro-social world exists in order to provide those simple tools. Now then, those groups can't be narcissistic. That's part of the multi-level dynamic. We can't be causing groups to function well and then causing harm up the scale. Those groups must be pro-social actors at higher levels, and that has to be part of the plan from the beginning. So the whole thing is there, and I think that, and it's not hard to understand. So I think that this gives me a strong sense of hope and optimism that we really can get going here, and it's within everyone's reach, basically, at least at the cellular level, to make that transition from functioning as an individual to functioning as members in numerous, really, small and appropriately structured groups. If the groups lack the structure, then groups of any size can be horrible. So the structure is needed. I see some nodding heads for my statement. Groups of any size can be horrible. Starting with couples. So, I mean, how many couples are exploitative, basically abusive? So, in fact, you can even go down to the individual. And some of my psychological colleagues are having a lot of fun thinking of the individual as a group. You're not a unitary.
Yeah, exactly.
No, you're a community of voices which are either cooperating or maybe tearing each other apart.
I like that.
Well, you might need therapy. Anyhow.
Like, in fact, there's a set of practices called internally family systems, which specifically looks at this idea of being a set of parts. And it was just occurring to me as you were talking, I wonder if we mapped out your core design principles into their system. It would be interesting to see how that worked. But yeah, well, I'm seeing the time now, and I want to make sure that we have a space for other people to join in the conversation. I'm also aware of the fact that, as you said, you hadn't actually yet stated the core design principles that you have developed. Do you want to take just a couple of minutes and just like summarize those, the 1 to 8?
Yeah.
Or why don't you do that, and then let's open it up to others to ask you questions directly or engage with their perspectives.
Before I do, and this is something that we might come out in the discussion, there's really 2 pillars, and we've only talked about one. One pillar are the core design principles, which basically have to do with governance, the governance of groups. Mm-hmm. The other principle has to do with adaptability. How flexible are you? And very often, we want to change, but we find out that we cannot. I mean, how many of you have actually kept your New Year's resolutions? And so to be flexible is something which, another thing that varies. There's another there's another bell-shaped curve for adaptability, and that's another thing that can be coached. Okay, so we could all improve our governance, and we could all improve our adaptability, and those draw from somewhat different islands of that fabled archipelago. So that other the adaptability part comes from the island of mindfulness-based therapy and training, especially something called acceptance and commitment therapy and training, founded by Steve Hayes. And like Eleanor Ostrom, Steve Hayes might be a rock star, or you might never have heard of him, depending upon what island you occupy. So there's 2 generalizations that took place. So back to the core design principles. I can keep it very quick, but before I do, I want you to keep a group in mind. Bring a group to mind, some group that you know well, might work poorly, and then see how that group implements the core design principles and whether that might have something to do with how well it functions as a group. So what Lynn found for common pool resource groups, and what we claim exists for all groups, first and foremost, a strong sense of identity and purpose. And so it's a group, it's important, who's a member, basically what you need to do. That defines the group. So that's the most important. Number 2, benefits proportional to costs. Not sustainable for some members to do most of the work and for others to get the benefits. That's the single game of Monopoly all by itself. What you get from the group should be proportional to what you give. Number 3, fair and inclusive decision making. Not sustainable for some members to make the decisions and others not to be part of that process. In the first place, that's a recipe for unfairness. In the second place, it doesn't make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Number 4, monitoring agreed upon behaviors. We need to know that we're doing what we're supposed to do. Number 5, appropriate responding. When we're not doing what we're supposed to do, something must be done about it, but it doesn't need to start out mean. Friendly reminders are typically enough to keep us in solid citizen mode, but it must be possible to escalate when necessary, and ultimately to exclude someone from a group if they just can't get along and if they just can't work with others. And while we're responding to unhelpful behaviors, we need to respond to helpful behaviors and basically praise good behavior at the same time that we're doing something about bad behavior. Number 6, conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they need to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. In a dispute, most people think they have a point of view. Number 7, local autonomy, elbow room to manage our own affairs. If we're being told what to do from the outside, of course, we can't do all those other things. And then finally, appropriate relations with other groups, which reflect the same core design principles. And so this illustrates that the core design principles are scale independent. And so they make as much sense as interactions among nations in the global village as among interactions among individuals in a real village. And so this is a tremendous conceptual simplification. The same core design principles are needed at all scales and all contexts. So against that background, I would really love to know, and we have done research around this, and what we've shown is that no matter what kind of group there is, you get that bell-shaped curve, just like Lynn found for common pool resource groups, and that the variation in performance, how well the group functions as a group, maps very strongly as to how well the group has implemented the core design principles.
Interesting. Wow. Thank you, David. What a great summary. And I just want to say the group I picked in my mind as you were talking through was actually the COP process. And after you went through these and I crossed off each one, I go, okay, I don't need any more explanations as to why COP is such a failure, because it basically fails with virtually every one of those processes. So that gave me such clarity around that, David.
Let me make a quick point, Jeremy, before we go, because I think it's so interesting. If you look at the core design principles, the word compassion is not mentioned once. It doesn't say groups were compassionate or so on. And so why is that? Now imagine that you are a compassionate person and you enter a group that strongly implements those core design principles and act. If you do act compassionately within that social environment, will you suffer for it or not? And so what those core design principles do is they provide the social environment that enables compassion to thrive. Beautiful. That enables compassion to thrive. And so people enter that environment. You don't have to tell them anything about compassion. Most people want to be compassionate. You don't have to teach them or prompt them. All they have to do is look around and see, oh, I can be safe here. I can come out of my shell. And very often they do. And if they try to be a bad actor, then that's what those mechanisms are there for, to make that. And so it basically makes the single game of Monopoly very, very difficult. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's such a wonderful way of understanding everything you're offering, basically. It's about setting the conditions to bring out the best qualities in our core humanity in a way that actually they get rewarded rather than punished. Yeah, thanks. Well, I should stop hogging the time with you now. I see more and more people with their hands up wanting to join the conversation. So let's do that. And let me turn to Justin, who I patiently had his hand up for a while there. Thanks, Justin. Well, let's hear from you, Justin. We've got to get you off mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm a bit nervous talking in front of a bunch of people. So this is an organic question, and I hope it becomes clear as I talk for a little bit. But the question revolves around quality of attachment. And I've heard Fritjof Capra say we're moving from a science of quantities to a science of qualities. And that qualities are mapped where quantities are measured. I know in the article you recommended for this discussion, Jeremy, from David, you mentioned that when you were talking about development, there's like a certain context that the eye needs to develop in. And if it doesn't, then we can need things like corrective lenses. So right now I'm reading the book Neurobiology and Development of Human Morality from Darshan Narvaez. And she talks at length about the evolved developmental niche and what she calls the evolved nest. And so I think a lot about how, because children, most of us in the West, developed outside of that evolved developmental nest, that we're actually wired to be more protective, less pro-social. So I'm just thinking about how when we develop in a species atypical way, which Darsha talks about, we're kind of conditioned towards separation, protection, and competition. Now, like I'm wondering about that with quality of attachment, because it seems like in order to have an appropriately structured group, you need a good quality of attachment or connection, so that the parts create a living whole. so that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and then you have those emergent properties. But we've actually evolved to develop within the context of those emergent properties, which we don't anymore. Yeah, so just thinking about like the quality of attachment and trying to like map that, I just wanted to like leave the question with just a quick reading, like a paragraph from Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett.
Perhaps we could actually stop there though right now, Justin, because I see other people lining up too. And I just feel you phrase that question and that issue so beautifully. Are you okay if we just kind of pause in the interest of time and just allow David to reflect on that? If you
I really thought it was important. It's like a really short paragraph.
Okay. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, just a paragraph. He says, the Pinaha all seem to be intimate friends, no matter what village they come from. Pinaha talk as though they know every other Pinaha extremely well. I suspect that this may be related to their physical connections. Given the lack of stigma attached to and the relative frequency of divorce, promiscuousness associated with dancing and singing, and post and prepubescent sexual experimentation, it isn't far off the mark to conjecture that Pinaha have had sex with a high percentage of other Pinaha. This alone means that their relationships will be based on an intimacy unfamiliar to larger societies. The community that sleeps together stays together, ? Imagine if you had sex with a sizable percentage of the residents of your neighborhood, and that this fact was judged by the entire society as neither good nor bad, just a fact about life, like saying you've tasted many kinds of food.
So there was your argument for polyamory. So, you raised so many issues there, Justin. One thing you've raised is there's so many great books on this topic. I mean, so this development is in full swing, and yet it's much less well known than, for example, complex systems thinking, and we need both. But I think just increasing literacy. One thing we've started over in our community, the Pro-Social Commons, is just a book club, and so we've currently listed 9 books that we could all read together in groups as we choose, and and the more we just gain general literacy on this view of life, multi-level, just the whole generalized Darwinism, then the more our common sense will be oriented, and the more we'll see that modern life is somehow just incredibly mismatched, which another point you made, Justin, with our adaptations. One of the speakers in the series, that same series as Jeremy's, was Peter Gray on the anxiety epidemic in children. And if you don't know Peter Gray's work, then you're in for a real treat, because he has such a profound insight, and that's very much based on hunter-gatherer societies. And the role of play in development of all sorts, intellectual development, social development, and the fact that play has been removed from the lives of our children is in part what is accountable for, people blame social media, and Peter will tell you that's blaming the wrong thing. And if you look at school, friends, it's the way our schooling is. And one of the indications of that is that if you look at suicide rates in young people, it's twice as high during the school years in the summer. Is that telling us something? And then if you look at what's so-called elite schooling, where the students are pushed the hardest, then there's all kinds of pathologies associated with elite schooling, what the most wealthy people are subjecting their children to, because they have the wrong thing inside their head. And this, Jeremy, is getting back to something which has been not forefronted in this conversation, of the whole concept of the pattern instinct and the web of meaning. And so much of how we act is based on how we think. And so just depending upon how you see the world is going to make sense of things, or is going to cause other things to be invisible. So the more literate we get, the more our common senses change, and the more we say, of course we should do this, not that. So that's why another reason why I'm hopeful is I think that there's just a kind of contact model here. Just please learn as much about this as you can. And there's so many wonderful books to be read. My own book, This View of Life, is a kind of a portal to other books. And Peter Gray is profiled in that, along with Steve Hayes and others. So Eleanor Ostrom. So my book is a kind of a portal to many other books.
Beautiful.
So thank you, Justin.
And thank you, Justin, for your reading of that paragraph. You're absolutely right. It was amazing. And I'll remember that. Thank you. Over to you, Elizabeth. Great to see you here.
Aloha, everybody. And
hello, Elizabeth.
David.
How are you?
So Greg, so delighted to be here with you, David, as a fellow evolution biologist. And I am such a big fan of yours because for so many years there just were not voices for the cooperation, and even the word community was put down as too close to communism, and to the point where people didn't even recognize how unbelievably cooperative humans are, living in cities of millions cooperating all day. Anyway, I also had the privilege of teaching evolution biology to Dave Corton. And Jeremy, you started out talking about the election, and I've been so frustrated about the two-party system that pits the two parties against each other in this kind of hostility. When in nature is profoundly conservative with things that work and radically progressively creative with things that don't work. And that's how our politics really should be operating, that we see this as every issue you look at to see, is this something we want to protect? Is it taking us forward? Or is it taking us backward and do we need to change it? So I'm wondering, the Olympics in Greece originally were designed to use competition in order to drive excellence. And it was, when we look at the Olympics today, it's mostly about who's winning. Even though we have teams winning, we don't talk about what that means, right? That they're the multi-level evolution selection. And so I'm wondering, how do we get this across? And I've wanted to do in schools to before a competitive ball game, somebody talks to the audience, the parents, not to the coach, not to the players, but talks to the audience and says, we're going to cheer excellence wherever we see it tonight. You're going to applaud every point made. And at the end of the game, the team that made the most points will have to give a party for the one we used to call the losing team, to thank them for driving them to the extra excellence. There are things like this that we could do socially, and I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about how can we get this across in the political world, that we cannot vote every 4 years to do one or the other. Either we're going to be conservatives or we're going to be progressives. How do we can start practicing it, obviously, in our local groups, but this is killing our world. I don't want to say any more. Let you talk.
Well, I mean, there's thank you, Elizabeth. There's so much to, and lovely to see you again. There's so much to say about this, and I think one thing to say is that competition is not a bad thing. It's competition applied in the right places. We need change, and so therefore we need to replace the bad stuff with the good stuff. But we need, of course, the right target of selection, and that's what you're talking about. I think when what counts as winning, and then and what's the relationship among the competitors after there's a current round of winning and losing, then. And sports is actually not a bad metaphor for some of this. I mean, sports is a highly refereed process of competition. And very often, members of opposing sports team after the game, they all go out for a drink. And so there's that camaraderie among among people in the whole sports, even diehard fans. If I'm a Boston Red Sox fan, I mean, there's a kind of a camaraderie I have with the Yankees fan. The whole thing has been kind of transferred into a region of play. And so what we need to do is we need to really construct. Part of all of this is it must be conscious. It must be conscious that if we're not consciously evolving our arrangements, that the perverse alchemist is going to win the game. We're going to get pathologies, and so it's against that background that we need to form targets of selection. They're going to always be systemic. They're always so complex that we don't know the right answer right away. The world is too complex for that. So we have to experiment. We have to orient variation around the average. Then we have to try stuff out. And then if something seems to work, we have to replicate it, realizing it might be sensitive to context. And so that's so straightforward the way I described it. But what that really is, and needs to become more so, is a process of conscious evolution. I just actually listed the 3 ingredients of variation, selection, and replication.
Yeah. Well, thanks, David. And thanks, Elizabeth, for that great question. Great to see you. And let's turn to Steve. Who's...
G'day, Jeremy. How you going?
Yeah.
G'day, Dave. Right. Jeremy's got a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about here, and you can moderate this little conversation if you like, Jeremy. I want to shift us from the theoretical conversational to the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm part of the core group, if not one of the main drivers at the moment, we're on the cusp of starting up a new society here in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And David, I would really like to invite you to be a part. Well, I want you to connect with what we're doing. You can come in any time, Jeremy. We're not
like Steve,
protocols. Yeah, okay. So,
Steve,
okay.
let me just ask you, do you have a particular question?
My question is, David, would you like to be a part of a new society of, in Jeremy's words, that's about to move to connect the technical with Indigenous wisdom?
Always. Absolutely. And so, some of my, the main members of Pro-Social World, my organization, are in Australia, including Paul Atkins and Robert Stiles. So we have an Australian connection, and a point that I want to, and combining technology with Indigenous wisdom is very important. One of my favorite books is Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. You're probably familiar with that book.
I know Tyson.
Yeah, and so he's a great guy. And I have a passage, I won't quote it, but I actually often do quote it in meetings such as this, which perfectly represents this this dynamic of selfishness versus prosociality in the form of Emu, the folk figure of Emu. Yeah. Who's the narcissist, who's the malignant narcissist, and how everyone has to control Emu. All the other animals have to control Emu. And then Tyson says, it takes a village to control malignant narcissism. Right. That's the whole thing. And the whole genius of Indigenous society, when it works well, is that it is successful at controlling the emus of the world. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely. But there's so many networks of networks is another point to make. And so combining networks, achieving basically network of networks level of organization is one of the important things we must do. So yes, please tell me more about your network, and then we'll proceed to work within that network and between networks. That's what multi-level is all about.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. And one thing I'll add, by the way, David and I have talked about ways in which we can try to connect up the pro-social world that and he's been developing with the Deep Transformation Network here. So I invite people both got ideas right now, but maybe more specifically afterwards when I upload the video of today's talk, to share ideas about what we might be able to do. And David was thinking maybe we should actually get volunteers, like if a handful of volunteers from each of the two groups to get together to create a working group and come up with specific recommendations. So let's maybe touch on that at the end. But I'm also aware we got like 5 or 6 questions still coming. I'm looking at the time. So let me turn to your label there as Stephen and Erica. Looks like I think I can see you both. And if each person can just keep the question fairly concise now, so that we can get everybody in before the end. Hey there.
Absolutely, Jeremy. Hello. Great gathering. As you were talking, David, there was I can't remember exactly what part, but just talking about the cooperation between groups. Integral theory, or you can think of spiral dynamics, levels of consciousness came to mind. And with what I've learned about it, I've tended to think that cooperation between the different levels is very difficult, as exemplified by the red-blue fight in the States. And I'm just wondering if you've considered how the pro-social principles can work. Can we really get cooperation at all these different levels of consciousness, and then between the different levels of consciousness?
Yeah, so integral, I'm very familiar with integral. And I was introduced to Ken Wilber by Kurt Johnson. Many of you might know Kurt Johnson and the Evolutionary Leaders. So there's a whole vast community. Terry Patton and his New Republic of the Heart. Terry worked with and I just had a meeting with past very unfortunately a while back, but his organization, his community, back to Network of Networks, New Republic of the Heart is still ongoing. And we were just meeting with them to work with that community and talking about a network of networks. And when we look at something like integral, it brings me back to web of meaning and worldviews. Integral is a fascinating worldview that is secular. Of course, it owes itself largely to Ken Wilber and functions like a modern religion, I would put it, which is a good thing, by the way, and has its own cosmology and so on. And there's much to say about it, and there needs to be, and there is an ongoing dialogue. And in this very short space, all I can say is that these, of course, are fellow travelers. They're all traveling in the same direction towards a whole earth ethic. Make no mistake about that. The stories they tell, the way they frame it, so on. There's differences, of course, and so in part, this is an exercise on how we can be pluralistic, and also the constraints of being scientifically accurate. And in Ken Wilber's Cosmos quadrants, there's the left and the right side, and the left side of is very pluralistic. It's the right side is a little bit more constraining in terms of what we say having to be based on the best of our scientific knowledge. And so I think some of the aspects of integral, when I read them as a evolutionary scientist, I have to be critical. I have to be critical about some aspects, and that should be no surprise because science is changing. The stage theory, for example, the idea that stages of human civilization are like stages of human development. As once was thought, it seems grotesque, I think, in a modern time, that once upon a time, good scientists and scholars thought that hunter-gatherer societies were at the developmental stage of children. Really? I mean, no, that's got to go. Yeah. So we have that kind of conversation to take place, but always realizing that we're fellow travelers, and what we're trying to do in common is to work towards global planetary cooperation. So it's quite complicated, actually, but a long conversation. One of the ones that we're starting to have a pro-social world, and that would be another one that definitely that conversation should also extend into the deep transformation network, because I'm certain that there's a large integral element of people in your community.
Yeah. Great. Well,
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks for that superb question, Stephen. And I really like what Risa just said in the chat. States replacing stages maybe as a way of getting that shift to happen. That's great. And I see we have just like 3 questions left, and we have about 10 minutes. So maybe we'll just stick with those 3 hands up right now. And 3 after Sean here. So we have 4 in total. So let's get going. Sean, welcome.
Hello, everybody. I would add to Deep Networks and Pro-Social Earth Regenerators as a group that you might want to contact. I wanted to say, and I get your response to the fact that Pro-Social is alive and well in the business community with remote first networks, businesses who practice with large numbers of remote workers. My daughter does this, and it's integral to her work in making for successful cultures. So response to that. The second thing is in reading Braiding Sweetgrass, the author says a wonderful thing, which is that ceremonies are our way of remembering to remember. And your comment about play leads me to ask the question, is play our way of remembering to be kind? Thank you.
Okay. Those are great, all 3 great. And so we have to keep things very short. This demonstrates the need to continue the conversation. We're very closely tied with Earth Regenerators. And I know that Jeremy's, this whole network was inspired by Earth Regenerators.
That's right.
Joe Brewer and I go back a long way. And actually, I just had, part of what we need to do is to understand the history of our own movements as an example of cultural evolution. And I had, Joe and I got together and he told a detailed oral history of Earth Regenerators from a cultural evolutionary perspective. This unfolded over 6 hours of conversation. It was a really deep dive because we're both obviously very knowledgeable about cultural evolution, and that can be made available publicly. And on business, absolutely, we're working with. Now you mentioned our remote first, which I had not heard of, but we are working with the conscious capitalism movement and actually a regenerative capitalism. And so this needs to unfold in the business world, and we are definitely doing that. So that's the best I can do in a very short space.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Over to David Corton. Welcome, David. Great to have you here on the network today.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you. Elizabeth noted quite correctly that she was part of my education in biology back in the days when biology was basically just discovering that life is alive, which I thought was very interesting. But my very first teacher was Dr. Mei-Wan Ho, who was a microbiologist. And she drew my attention to the obvious fact that each of our bodies is comprised of tens of trillions of diverse cells and microorganisms. And we exist as living beings because somehow all of those individual organisms self-organize to create and maintain this vessel of our consciousness and this instrument of our agency. You know, when I met her and she pointed this out to me at a conference in Spain, it just blew my fucking mind.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so obvious. You don't need proof. You don't, you know, we know it, and yet we never discuss it. Now, my field from, you know, my academic field is business organization. So the issues of how we organize are quite fundamental to my education. Now, it was right after this meeting with Mei-Wan Ho that I met Elizabeth Sahtouris. Now, Elizabeth is working with the organism of Earth. And the incredible thing there is, as we get to the depths of astronomy, The astronomers have yet to identify any other planet that they have reason to believe on its surface has the conditions essential to our life existence. Wow, that's interesting. So what makes Earth different? And of course, if you look at that, you realize it is life on Earth that has created the conditions essential to the existence of life as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's fascinating. Now, as I've been listening to this conversation, I sense there are, well, in a way it's multi-level, but it's even a more complex kind of multi-level, because we could talk about communities of like type organisms, like communities of humans or particular animals and so forth. And that seems to be mainly what we're focused on here. And that is one kind of organization where all these complex issues of the interplay of cooperation and competition come in. But the even far deeper issue is this issue of how life organizes. And the thing I've come to is that life exists only in communities. Complex, diverse communities that together somehow, by ways that we're so far from even beginning to comprehend, self-organize to create and maintain the conditions essential to their existence. And then, of course, this whole thing is subject to these processes of evolutionary progress, which again creates very interesting questions about what is our human place in the evolution of life on Earth and in the cosmos. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering how, in terms of the question, where does this aspect of life creating the conditions essential to life come into your framework, David?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, David. And I always love talking with you. I think one of the amazing things, so often we need to have like a sort of a macro evolutionary account, in addition to a micro evolutionary account. And Jeremy, this is true of your narrative. We really want to tell some kind of story that involves the whole universe and everything from the origin of life all the way into the future. And what's amazing is that the microevolutionary account that we've been dwelling on here, the things that are really salient to our groups right now, the eternal struggle between different behavioral strategies right now, also can provide the macroevolutionary account as to the various forms of organization in the biological world, all the way to the origin of life as groups of cooperating molecular reactions. So to your point, David, we could actually talk about the origin of life as a triumph of cooperation at the molecular levels in those little tiny proto cells. And so we have a single framework for everything from the origin of life to nucleated cells, multicellular organisms, social insect societies, microbiomes, and then human origins, the last 10,000 years of human history. We mentioned ancient Greece recently, which actually is beautiful work on the emergence of democracy in ancient Greece, all the way up to the present work by current day nations, Why Nations Fail by Darren Asimoglu and others, and then extending into the future to what's sometimes called the noosphere. So there's your grand story, and much better connected, in my opinion, to the micro story of multi-level selection and generalized Darwinism. I feel it's like it's taking the macro story and just improving our eyesight about the whole thing, sharpening our vision about the whole thing. And all of this is available in beautifully written books and online, richly available online. So the more we can direct people's attention to it, to increase that literacy, then the more that will change common sense, and the more different actions will flow from that common sense, in addition to more organized things we might do.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for
I just
bringing
add
this.
very quickly that
David, if I could, like,
Two more people in the queue. Two more
interrupt you,
people
David,
in the
yeah.
queue.
It's a quarter past, and I was going to say, like, we are out of time, but if it's okay with you, David, let's keep going. Maybe just so those two questions people patiently waiting can ask, but then we'll have to call that a close. But feel free to join in the conversation when I upload this on the Deep Transformation Network with any questions, thoughts, to keep the conversation going. Over to you, Peter, and then we'll finish with Katie. Thank you.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think this is terrific session. I'm so grateful for it. I come from two different archipelagos. Right now, I'm speaking to you from our farm in the mountains of Western Panama, which we live half the year. But I also am a neurobiologist, and I've written a book called Principles of Neural Design, which I think really is just the iceberg below your your higher levels things. And that's what I'm quite excited about. I wanted to make one point that I made in that book and a later book called What is Health, that is the human brain, when you look at individuals, the cortex is full of modules. It has about 200 modules. It can't get any larger because it has to fit in the skull. And so the only way human intelligence can advance is by giving each individual a unique set of modules. And so there are people who, for example, like Oliver Sacks, who miss the modules for recognizing faces. There are other people at the other end of this bell-shaped curve who are super recognizers, and they work for Scotland Yard and the FBI. So, and this is true of every trait. And so a small group of 20 individuals in a community is going to have unique sets, which people practice their unique traits because that's rewarding. And so the only thing is that they have to get along. And that's where I study brains moves up to the level of pro-social cooperation. And so I find this a very unifying session for me, and I thank you for it. I really admire what you guys are doing. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you. And we'll go right on to the next question, Peter, but just basically, yes, all of the above. And so more, please, is the only way I can respond to that in such a short space.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, Katie, let's
Yes.
close with you, Katie.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. I'll try to be really concise. Thank you so much for today. So on your points for the way to do this, points 4 to monitor, point 5 to appropriate responding, etc. Point 6, conflict resolution. I wonder if you'd refer us to any reading about those in particular. And my context for that is I'm a psychotherapist, and what I see working with families and couples is that if I create a very simple infrastructure for a scaffolding for the way that they can communicate without blame, it's miraculous.
Yes, Katie. And so again, so much to say, but in a therapeutic context, this is highly relevant. And I have an article with Jim Cohen. You might know James Cohen at the University of Virginia. So much to say here. But the title of the article is Groups as Organisms, Implications for Therapy and Training. And so it's the implications of all of this for therapy and training, and how much the therapeutic relationship is one of building a group, basically a supportive group at the level of the relationship between the therapist and the trainer. But of course, that can't go on forever. And so what's really important for somebody that needs therapy is not therapy so much as to get that person into a supportive group context. To be alone and to be without social support is one of the biggest evolutionary mismatches of all. Yeah. And so there's so much to be said here. And again, so my great hope is that this catalyzes basically similar conversations. Very happy to come back Very happy to introduce you to my colleagues. Let's build that bridge between our two communities. And whenever you want to form into a group that cross that watershed between acting as an individual to acting as a functionally organized groups, then we want to work with you. And so that's what we're working towards.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David. It's just been an incredible pleasure to spend this time together in community here. And I just reinforce what David just said. Anyone who's in this group right now who is really inspired at the idea of making these connections with the pro-social group, wants to explore this conversation further, I'll try to get this recording up on the Deep Transformation Network either later today or tomorrow, and use that as a space to join the conversation and to share your ideas, to volunteer, so we can maybe really take this to the next level of deepening our interaction. It's been so rich and educative and inspiring for all of us. Thank you, David. And until next time, and let's make sure that next time is soon. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.